Thanks for joining me in today's video Bible study. I'm Ryan Goodwin. I preach for the East Shelby Church of Christ in Collierville, Tennessee. If you have any questions or comments, then leave them in the comment section below. Or if you'd like to learn more about our church, then find us at eastshelby.com. We've been going through the book of Ecclesiastes lately, and we're all the way up to chapter 3. So if you've got your Bible handy, open up to the Old Testament, and about halfway through you'll find Ecclesiastes, and we'll start in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 in verse 1. The writer says, "And there is an appointed time for everything. There's a time for every event under heaven." Now let's understand, the writer is not saying that everything that happens on planet Earth has been predetermined or pre-written by God. He's simply saying there is an appropriateness to the way that things unfold, that things happen in an appropriate and often very predictable way. And he's going to offer some examples here in verses 2 and onward. Of course, we understand that the writer is talking about vain things in the book of Ecclesiastes. He's wondering, is there anything on planet Earth, just life under the sun, taking God out of the equation, is there anything in this life that can leave me feeling satisfied? Is there lasting happiness or contentment, purpose or meaning to be found in life under the sun? And so far, all of the things that he's tried have been failures. He's tried wealth and possessions, and he's tried physical pleasure or hedonism. He's even tried wisdom, and even his wisdom has left him feeling very unsatisfied. Vanity of vanities, he says, of all life. It's all vanity. Surely the most vain commodity of them all is time. You think you have plenty of it, and yet it goes like that. Time is so strange, especially if you're watching this video during the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. Sometimes it feels like you've got all the time in the world, and yet other people are busier now than they've ever been. You're sitting around your house with nothing to do but make jigsaw puzzles or binge on Netflix, but you can't seem to make the time for your kids or your spouse. It feels like March was the longest month ever. And maybe have we discovered like the cure for time going so quickly? I don't think so, because it's so interesting how at different points in your life, different phases of your life, time seems to go at different speeds. When you're young and you're so eager to move on to the next phase of life, you're so eager to go from middle school to high school, from high school to college, and college into adulthood. But then you become an adult, and it just seems like the weeks, the months and the years, they vanish so quickly. Time, just like everything else that the writer has been exploring, is vain. Vanity of vanities. Right there along with wealth and hedonism and earthly wisdom, time is a vain thing. For as predictable as it is, for as appropriate as he says all these things happen, it is still, by nature, a vain thing. So he's going to explain some of these things beginning in verse 2. There is a time to give birth, and there's a time to die. There's a time to plant, and a time to uproot what is planted. And we understand how these things work. Anybody who has ever had a friend or a family member, or even perhaps if you have gone through this with your own children, anybody who has ever experienced anything related to premature birth knows the dangers involved in it. There is an appropriate time for children to be born. There is an appropriate time at the end of a certain amount of time when a child is developed in the womb properly and it's time to come out. There's a time to be born, but there's also a time to die. Now that's a lot harder to predict, but the fact that all of us are going to die one day, that's unavoidable. You are going to die. I am going to die. One day my kids will die, and my grandchildren will die, assuming that my children even end up having kids of their own. We are all going to die unless the Lord comes back in judgment first. There is an appointed time for us to die. when your physical body is exhausted, when it has been expended, you will die. So verse 3, he goes on to say there's a time to kill and a time to heal. Now, he's not saying that it is always moral to kill, that it's always the right thing to do in a moral sense to kill. He's simply saying that killing often happens in a fairly predictable manner. That you can see when there's a time to kill, that people do kill each other. And I think as long as people are people, as long as people live on planet Earth, this fallen and cursed place as it is, there will be a time to kill. But there's also a time to heal. And you need to make sure that you understand that as well. There's a time to tear down and a time to build up. There's a time to preserve old buildings. There's a time to keep things as they are. There is a time to cherish old traditions. But there's also a time to tear those things down. Just because a building is old doesn't mean it needs to stay. Just because a tradition has been around for a long time doesn't mean that it's a useful or valuable tradition any longer. There's a time to tear things down, and there's a time to build them up. A time, he says in verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's a right time to weep, and there's a right time to laugh. And don't mix those two things up. Make sure that you're doing things, you're behaving in a way that is appropriate given the circumstances of whatever you're facing. I remember Romans chapter 12 in the New Testament. In Romans chapter 12, the writer there, speaking of course from a Christian perspective rather than an Ecclesiastes perspective, but the writer of Romans 12 says, weep when others are weeping, laugh when others are laughing. Jesus himself says in the Sermon on the Mount, in the Gospel of Matthew, he says here in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. There is a right time to laugh. And I think all of us have experienced a time or a moment where it was the wrong time to laugh, where you laughed at a statement that somebody made. You thought they were joking about it. You thought that they had a sense of humor about it. But oh no, they weren't kidding. They don't have a sense of humor about it. We've all stuck our foot in our mouth at some point. As a preacher, as someone who talks for a living, I've probably stuck my foot in my mouth more times than you have. More times certainly than my wife is comfortable with. She's been there and seen it and heard it before. But there's a time to laugh and there's a time to weep. And don't get those two things mixed up. He says in verse 4, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Verse 5, there's a time to throw stones and there's a time to gather stones. Now understand, in the context of what Solomon is talking about here, he may be talking about a form of total warfare that was practiced in that time period where, and you can see an example of this, by the way, in the Old Testament. In 2 Kings chapter 3, you can see an example of this played out. But in warfare, when you wanted to sabotage the economic capability of your enemies, you would take large stones and throw them out into their fields. You'd get your army, instead of going out and attacking their army, you'd get your soldiers to pick up large stones and throw them in the fields. And what that would do is it would prevent them from farming that land, or at least it would put a stumbling block or an obstacle in the way of them farming that land. So you're effectively practicing this total warfare. There is a time to throw stones, right? And even in modern warfare, there's a time to throw the grenade. There's a time to bust the bunker. There's a time to destroy buildings, to tear up roads, to ruin railways. There is a time to destroy, but there's also a time to gather those stones back up. There's a time to go back to your enemy, or at least the one who at one point was your enemy. When the warfare is over, go back and fix things. Rebuild those roads. Rebuild that infrastructure. Reach out in mercy, in charity, in benevolence. There's a time to throw the stones. There's also a time to gather the stones back up. Verse 5, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. There is an appropriate time to draw a line in the sand, to tell people when it comes to moral matters or ethical issues, there is a time to draw that line in the sand and say, we cannot have friendship with each other as long as you live a certain way, as long as you're practicing that sin. I can't cross that line with you. I can't follow you into that sin. There's a time to embrace people. There's a time to love people, to accept people. There is a time to hug people. There is a time to embrace. There's also a time to shun embracing. The Apostle Paul had this to say in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There was a certain situation that the Corinthian church was facing, and it was a sinful situation where there was a man who had a sexual relationship with his stepmother, essentially. And he says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. Now I did not at all mean with the immoral people of this world, with the covetous and swindlers, with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world. But actually I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother, if he should be an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. Now I think as a follow-up to that, the Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians, so go a few more pages in your New Testament, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and in verse 6 he says, sufficient for such a one is this punishment which was inflicted by the majority, so that on the contrary you should rather forgive and comfort him, lest somehow such a one be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. Wherefore I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. Was there a time to shun the sinner? Yes. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul says, don't even eat with such a one. But was there a time then to embrace the former sinner, to embrace the repentant one, to embrace the person who has learned his or her lesson, is willing to change his or her life, and come back to God? There's a time to embrace. There's a time to shun embracing. Going back to Ecclesiastes 3, it says in verse 6, a time to search and a time to give up as lost. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus gives a few parables there. Several parables. One is about a woman who loses a coin in her house. Another is about a shepherd who loses a sheep. And a third one is about a father who loses a prodigal son. Now, in those parables, Jesus extols the virtues of the people who were seeking that which was lost. There is a time to seek things that are lost, but there's also a time to give up as lost. There's a time to move on. There's a time to understand that what you're searching for is not worth the effort. He goes on to say in verse 6, a time to keep and a time to throw away. Now, I don't think this verse was written as just this attack on people who have a problem with hoarding, and you know who you are, but I do think there's a lesson to be learned here. There's a time to keep things, right? There are things that are important. There are keepsakes out there. There are valuable treasures, family heirlooms, things that help us remember our past, photographs and treasured memories, right? There are things that we keep. And it's fine to keep them. Well, there's a time to throw away as well, because you can't keep everything. One of my children, and I won't say who it is, I don't want to make him embarrassed or anything like that, but I only have one son, so I suppose those who know my family know exactly who I'm talking about. But one of my children just can't stand to get rid of anything. For him, everything has special value. Every rock, every stick, every gum wrapper, everything to him is a keepsake. It's a connection to the past. But the problem is, if you're allowed to keep everything, you don't have room for anything. Your home, your room, your garage, your car, your pockets, it all just becomes so full of junk, so inundated with objects that none of them have any value. In fact, the things that have real value end up getting ruined by the garbage. You know, we used to watch a show called Hoarders. I don't know if that show is still on or if you can binge watch it on one of the streaming services, but it's a show about people who hoard. They keep everything, whether it's trash and old newspapers and magazines and old clothes and shoes. They keep everything. But the problem is that when you keep everything, the trash ends up destroying the things that have actual value to them, like your home. And so they go in with the show Hoarders and they help remove all the junk from a house. They get rid of all the garbage. They clear it all out. And what ends up happening is the carpets are ruined. The floorboards are ruined. They have to remove walls because there's stenches and there's mold and rot. And so your most valuable thing, which is your home or your furniture or your car, those valuable things end up being destroyed because of all the garbage and the junk. There's a time to keep and there's a time to throw away. And it takes some wisdom to know the difference between the two. Verse 7 of Ecclesiastes 3, there's a time to tear apart and there's a time to sew together. There's a time to be silent, and there's a time to speak. Again, as a preacher, someone who talks for a living, that's a really hard one to follow. It's very difficult to understand when to keep your mouth shut. When I was a younger preacher, I thought I had to have an opinion on everything. And I thought that my opinion was worth the publicity that I was giving to it. So I thought that if I would publicize everything, that I would make everything known, offer my opinion on everything, because why not? Don't people want to know Ryan Goodwin's opinions? Don't people want to know what I had to say? And there were many, many times as a younger preacher that I probably should have kept my mouth shut. In areas where I really didn't have any expertise, where I really didn't have any knowledge, in areas where by involving myself, I actually made the problem worse, hurt people's feelings, spoke where I had no knowledge. There's a time to speak. There's also a time to shut your mouth and keep silent. A time to listen. The book of James in the New Testament says something along these lines. In James chapter 1, look at the way the apostle writes it here in James chapter 1 and verse 19. James chapter 1 and verse 19. This you know, my beloved brethren, but let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. You don't always have to be quick to speak. You don't always have to give your opinion on everything. And I do think we face a challenge in 2020 with the accessibility and the availability of platforms where you can just give your opinion on everything. You know, when you're scrolling through Facebook, you don't have to comment on everything. Right? You don't have to give your opinion on everything. You don't have to chime in all the time. Sometimes, just keep it to yourself. And again, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or putting images out there on Instagram, like you don't have to advertise every meal that you eat and every opinion that you have and every epiphany, right, that comes into your life. You don't have to say everything. Some stuff, just keep it to yourself. Now, he brings this section to a close in verse 8. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. And I want to reiterate something. He is not saying that every war is a good thing, or that every time you hate, it is morally right to hate. He's not giving us like carte blanche approval to commit acts of war and to hate people and to hate things. This is not carte blanche approval for war and hatred and violence. He's just saying that when you kind of take a step back and look at life under the sun in a more dispassionate way, and when you observe human history and the way people treat each other and the way that war happens, and he says when you just look at humanity, things tend to happen in a fairly predictable manner. You can see when it's a time for war. You can see when it's a time for hate. You can see when it's a time for love and a time for peace. You can just see the way those things happen in their time as humans interact with each other. It's not always pretty. It's not always right. It's not always good. It's not always what you want to have happen. But there's a time for it. Time is vain, just like everything else. Money and possessions, health and wealth and youth and personal physical satisfaction. Time, when you take God out of the picture, that is, time is just as vain as anything else that you find in life under the sun. So he's going to start making some application here, beginning in verse 9. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 9. So what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their hearts, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning, even to the end. There's a built-in frustration that the writer is addressing here. The frustration is we have a sense of time, but we don't really have a grasp on it. Like we understand time in a theological, or excuse me, in a theoretical sense. We understand the passing of seconds, and we understand what a minute is, what a day is, what a year is. And at least on a theoretical level, we understand a lifetime, or a century, or what a millennium is, right? We understand, again, on a mathematical or theoretical level, we understand what those things are. We even understand, to a degree, what eternity is, right? We have symbols that represent infinity as a numerical value. We understand eternity. Again, in a theoretical sense, we understand what eternity is. We know what the dictionary definition of eternity is. If I ask you what is a million or a billion or a trillion, you, again, in a mathematical sense, you know what those things are. But do you really have any idea what 1,000 years is like as it passes? Do you really have any idea what 1 million miles is in any kind of spatial sense? Right? We have a theoretical sense of time and large numbers, but we don't really have a grasp on it. And so I like the way that he puts it here in verse 11, that he's made everything appropriate in its time. He has set eternity in the hearts of men, yet so that men will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning. And to me, the way I take this verse is that we have that kind of like basic theoretical sense of eternity and the activities of God, but we'll never really fully grasp it. And that frustrates us. It frustrates us. And we are the only beings on planet Earth that allow that frustration. Does your dog ever sit there on the floor and kind of think like, oh, the passing of time. These days just grow shorter and shorter, don't they? Does your dog ever sit and think about the seasons like, boy, I just love the autumn. But I love this time of year. Does your dog sit and think about eternity? Do the squirrels in your backyard run around your trees stealing from your bird feeder? Do the squirrels think about like the passing of time and eternity and life being so brief? Life is so brief. Like, the animals don't do that. Humans are the only beings on planet Earth that sit here and ponder time and philosophize about it and are so frustrated by it. I don't think your dog is frustrated that he's only going to live to be like 10 to 15 years old. Like, that doesn't bother your dog. But if you think about all the things that you want to do on planet Earth and you only have one lifetime to do them, and you're only going to be as young and vigorous and strong as you are for just half of that even, it'd be kind of frustrating. And maybe if God is not a part of that mathematical equation, then you'll come to the same conclusion as Solomon. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Verse 12, Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 12. I know there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. This is the gift of God. So just like at the end of chapter 2 that we discussed in our last class, there are these little moments, right? In the midst of all the despair, in the midst of all the vanity of vanities and Solomon getting all down on himself, there are these little moments, these glimpses into what is right and good, into what is not vanity of vanities. And he's giving that to us in verses 12 and onward. But he says in verse 14, I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. We need to know our place, is essentially what he's saying. We need to understand that there are certain truths in the universe that are never going to change. They will never bend. They will never break. Just because we don't like them, just because we really hate them and we're bothered by them, there are certain truths. There are scientific truths, physical aspects of this universe that cannot be broken, that cannot be bent. There are certain constants in the universe that cannot be changed. But there are also moral and ethical truths. There are things about the spirit of man. There are things that are built into us in a spiritual and a moral and an ethical sense. Our understanding of God as a being has to be based on real, actual truth. You don't just get to have God on your terms. Like, I just want any kind of God that's convenient for me. Well, that's irreconcilable with the truths that we see. I know that everything God does will remain forever. That's kind of hearkening back to chapter 1, isn't it? I understand this, that there's nothing to add to it, there's nothing to take from it. God has so worked that men should fear him. That which is, and you're going to see that same monotony that you saw at the end of chapter 1, echoed here in verse 15 of chapter 3. That which is has been already. That which will be has already been, for God seeks what is passed by. Furthermore, in verse 16, I have seen under the sun that in the place of justice there's wickedness. In the place of righteousness there is also wickedness. I said to myself in verse 17, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there. Now, we'll stop there just for a sec and make a comment. This is not the last time that Solomon is going to talk about how frustrating it is to see unrighteousness in the place of righteousness, to see injustice sitting in the seat of justice. Does that bother you as much as it bothers Solomon? Probably. Does it bother you that there's corruption in governments? Does it bother you that there's money changing hands, that there's money going under the table, stuff that's not on record? Does it bother you that one group is influencing another and that evil and injustice is the result? Does that bother you? It should. Now here's the connection. With God, there is no evil influence. With God, there is no, sometimes it's right and sometimes we just let it slip. With God, there is no fickleness and changing of opinions, no changing the law, no changing the standard, no changing the ruler. With God, right is right and wrong is wrong, and He has set that from time eternal. And so if you take God out of the equation, as Solomon is trying to do in this grand experiment of his, if you take God out of the equation, what are you left with? Just fickle man. No wonder Solomon is in despair. No wonder he says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Because if you are just looking at life under the sun, there's not a lot of substance there. There's no truth there. There's no compass there. So he says in verse 18, I said to myself concerning the sons of men, God has surely tested them in order for them to see that they are but beasts. For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is all the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath. There is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place, he says in verse 20. All came from the dust. All return to the dust. Who knows, verse 21, who knows that the breath of man ascends upward and the breath of beast descends downward to the earth? I have seen that nothing is better than that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? Isn't that the dilemma of the unbeliever? If you just look at life under the sun, no God, he's not part of the equation. If you just look at life under the sun, is there any evidence, on a physical level at least, that the outcome of our lives as humans is any different than that of the animals? When your dog dies, you bury him in the backyard, he decomposes, the worms eat him, he returns to the dust. From the dust your dog came, to the dust your dog will return. And I don't mean to be blunt about all of this, because I know this is an area that a lot of us, that we have to face. We have to confront this dilemma. But if there is no God, and if we're all just purely physical beings, we're just physical beings existing on a physical planet that someday, whether it's 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years from now, is going to be burned out by our sun, if that's all there is to it, there is no evidence whatsoever. There is no reason to believe that you are any more special than a dead possum on the side of the road. Nothing. Now that's blunt and that's a horrible thing to say, isn't it? But if there is no God, take him out of the equation, there is nothing special about you. Nothing. You're just a physical being on a physical planet. And you're going to end up just like all the other animals. The possum on the side of the road, the bug splattered on your windshield, your dog, your pet that you bury in the backyard. Good guys, bad guys, criminals and policemen, politicians and the people who bribe them, heroes and villains. We're all just going to die. And there is no physical evidence to lead you to believe that the breath of man, when it leaves the body, ascends upward to be with its spiritual Maker, Creator, Lord, and Savior. There is no evidence to believe that our breath, our spirit, our being ascends upward, whereas the animals descend downward back to the earth. There's no physical evidence. So you've got to face that dilemma. Solomon tried physical things, wealth and health and hedonism and sex and all of the stuff from chapter 2. He tried all of that. He tried legacy, like maybe if I'm just rich enough, powerful enough. He tried wisdom. Maybe if I'm just smart enough, I can outsmart the despair that's within me. At the end of the day, after trying all of those things and many, many more, he's left with this one fact. If I don't factor God into the equation, I am no better than a dead bug, a dead animal. Any one of the beasts out there, I am no better, no more special, no more valuable. If you're not a Christian, I certainly hope you'll become one. Whatever spiritual need you have, reach out to the East Shelby Church of Christ, and we'd love to study with you. Tune in for our next studies. We get into chapter 4 and move through the book of Ecclesiastes, because there is an end to all of this. And when we get to chapter 12, Solomon is finally going to find the answer to the questions that he's been asking. So you got to stick around to find out what happens at the end. As always, my friends, I hope that you have a blessed day and that this study has been beneficial to you.